Hello, and welcome to another episode of Unworthy History. Today we got some more actual history for you from this book right here, Arizona Characters by Frank C. Lockwood. This book was published all the way back in 1928. Now, today's episode is about one of the characters from this book, a man named Old Bill Williams. He was a hunter, trapper, and guide who lived in the Rocky Mountain region around the 1830s and 1840s. Who was this Bill Williams? I stood on the platform of the Santa Fe station in the town of Williams, Arizona, and gazed off at Bill Williams Mountain that towered grandly above us under the strangely blue and lovely sky. "That's something no one around here don't seem to know," replied the old-timer whom I had addressed. "But your town's named after him, and that mountain, and there's a stream over there that flows into the Colorado below Needles that they call Bill Williams Fork. He must have been a big man around here." "That's true, stranger, but I've been living in these parts for 40 years, and I never heard of no one who ever knowed him. He was a hunter and trapper that roamed all over the Rocky Mountains 100 years ago or more. Everyone's heard about him, but no one ever seed him as far as I know." The old fellow told the truth. Bill Williams remains a being half myth, half mystery. Like Melchizedek, he seems to be without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. Securely as his name is rooted in Arizona, it seems impossible to get accurate data about his doings here. He was very eccentric. The Indians of the far northwest called him the Lone Elk. Bands of trappers would meet him everywhere from British Columbia to the Colorado River. But he did not remain long in any company. He would up and away on short notice, and for months at a time no one would have knowledge of his whereabouts. Hunters and trappers, to be sure, were not men given to keeping diaries or to writing events down with pen and ink. Like old Bill Williams himself, they left their record on the face of nature in deeds, not in words. Each one had as his sign manual a river, a canyon, or a mountain peak. Yet some meager accounts have come down to us from these men of the wild, and almost invariably in the stories that have survived, we find mention of old Bill Williams. In his prime, Bill Williams was long and lank, all muscle and sinew. He was red-headed once, but in old age no one could determine the color of his matted and faded mane. His eyes were gray before Arizona sunlight and Rocky Mountain snows dimmed their fires. He was about 1/4 civilized and half savage. He was the very type of the Wild West in its really wild days. He was a dead shot with a rifle, but he shot with a curious double wobble. He walked with a double wobble too. His long, sinewy limbs were tireless, but he rambled continually back and forth across the trail, instead of tramping straight ahead. He was not surpassed as a hunter and trapper, and it was the passion of his life to kill more deer and trap more beaver than any other man. He spent almost his entire life among the Indians, and no one knew their ways so well as he. In cunning and the reading of sign, he was more than a match for them. He would pitch his camp within the limits of a hostile tribe, and come and go among them with impunity, baffling their shrewdest strategy. Single-handed, he was a terror to them. He bore the scars of many fights, but he was hard to kill, and he came and went throughout the West for nearly half a century. Ichabod Crane himself was not more lean, awkward, and ludicrous on horseback than was old Bill Williams, yet his tenacity in the saddle was not surpassed by George Washington or a Texas cowboy. Neither horse nor mule could unseat him. He rode with the same uncouth distinction that he walked, with stirrups so short that his knees hobnobbed with the pommel of his saddle. He leaned forward over his saddlebow with his rifle crosswise before him, and his head rising and falling with each motion of his steed. Sometimes he was crowned with a greasy black hat with flapping brim, sometimes in bitter weather with a blanket cap, the two corners drawn up into wolfish, satyr-like ears. If he deigned to go in company with others, he always rode ahead, talking in a whining, thin, cracked voice, and in a tone that left the hearer in doubt whether he was laughing or crying. He seemed oblivious to his surroundings, careless of ever-lurking danger, but in reality his keen gray eyes were everywhere, and he missed no telltale sign, however slight. His buckskin hunting shirt, as ample as his trousers were scant, was smooth and stiff with grease. Most of the ornamental fringe on the inside seam of his pants had been plucked away to serve as thongs for his moccasins or his pack saddle. Though far from elegant, his accoutrement exemplified the artistic laws of fitness and economy of material. It consisted of a powder horn and bullet pouch, a worm with which to clean his rifle, a bullet mold for running balls, an awl with deer horn handle, and the point defended by a case of cherry wood carved by his own hand, and a little bottle made from the point of an antelope's horn scraped transparent, which contained the medicine used in baiting his traps. All of these articles in proper order hung from the broad strap that encircled his shoulder. Other trappers felt safe when he led the party. He always found the line of least resistance through thicket and canyon, and he had a sure eye for the spot where wood, water, and grass combined to make the most desirable camp. He was beyond the power of fatigue, and his guard was so strict and complete that no Indian foe was able to surprise his camp or stampede his horses. When fighting Indians in the company of others, he was always cool and brave, but he fought on his own hook, and decided for himself when he would fight and when he would retire. If he made up his mind to Cash, it was out of question to persuade him to go on with the fight, and it was equally out of the question for the Indians to find his hiding place after he withdrew. The tradition is that Bill Williams was a Methodist, a preacher, that he came from Missouri as a missionary to the Osage Indians, that he learned the Osage language and the languages of other Indian tribes, and that he translated the Bible into various Indian tongues, and so was of great service to missionaries who came after him. W. E. Curtis, at one time correspondent of the Chicago Record, stated that Bill Williams traveled among most of the Indian tribes of the West, from the Kaws to the Apaches and Mojaves, and that he would sojourn a while with one tribe and adopt its customs and language, and then move to another. He had a marked linguistic gift. I believe it was Henry Ward Beecher who said that the Methodists preach the doctrine of falling from grace, and the Presbyterians practice it. At any rate, old Bill Williams did not exemplify the doctrine of the perseverance of the saints, but fell immeasurably from grace. He seems to have formed his closest alliance with the Ute nation. He lived among them, adopted their manner of life, and took one or more squaws from that tribe. Periodically, after long solitary trapping expeditions, old Bill Williams would make his appearance at the great summer rendezvous in the heart of the Rocky Mountains, or at Taos, fair Taos, the remote outpost of semi-civilization, romantic meeting place of trappers, scouts, and mountain men of all breeds and varieties, where fascinating dark-eyed Mexican women were more than willing to assist the masterful Americans in the disbursement of their riches on these rare occasions when they came in to exchange their peltry for gold and drink and arms, and ammunition, and the witchery of the dance hall. An occasional glorious spree. This was all that Bill Williams got out of his strenuous and dangerous labors. Once he came to Taos and in 3 or 4 weeks spent $6,000, the reward for many months of trapping, and then went back to his lonely haunts in debt. He would gamble sometimes until he lost all of his money and his animals, and then borrow enough to make a new start. If he could not dispose of his money fast enough in drinking, gambling, and carousing, he would sometimes buy whole bolts of gorgeously printed calico, as costly then and as attractive to the feminine eye as silk or satin now, and holding the end of the roll, and throwing the bolt as far from him as his powerful arm could send it, he would display the bright patterns to the dazzled eyes of the senoritas, and take hilarious delight in seeing them scramble to get each her share of it. His spree being over, he would outfit, and back again he would go to the mountains, after a long absence reappearing and always loaded down with beaver skins. Once only did he return to civilization during 20 years, and he went back then in charge of a military escort. He had been arrested then for fooling the soldiers into the belief that he was a hostile Indian. In his buckskin suit, he drew them on a long and desperate chase over the prairies, before they discovered that he was a white man making sport of them. Old Bill Williams had been known as a hunter, trapper, and guide, and mountaineer for 40 years when in the late autumn of 1848, John C. Fremont engaged him to guide his fourth expedition over the highest and wildest ranges of the Rocky Mountains. 3 survivors of this terrible experience have left records of what was suffered and endured: Fremont himself, Thomas E. Breckinridge, and Micajah McGahee. Fremont and McGahee tell their stories in the Century magazine of March 1891, and Breckinridge's narrative appeared in the Cosmopolitan of August 1896. In addition to these accounts by men who were members of the party, there is contemporary allusion made to Bill Williams and his connection with the expedition in Ruxton's Life in the Far West. I attempt here to combine in the most condensed form the tragic facts as they are related by the writers named. From the first, Bill Williams was of the opinion that the route Fremont insisted upon taking was not practicable at that time of year. Both McGahee and Breckinridge state that Williams was unwilling to take this route, and was with great difficulty persuaded to do so. The old trappers of Pueblo were all agreed that it was foolish to attempt this route in winter. At Wet Mountain, Dick Wooten, an old Colorado mountain man, took a look across the frightful cold and desolation of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains ahead, and then deliberately took the back trail, saying, "There is too much snow ahead for me." Bill Williams wanted to take a route further to the south, along the Colorado and New Mexico border, but Fremont persisted in his decision to cross the high ranges. It was now early December, the weather grew colder and the snow deeper as the company advanced. All game had left these icy regions, and there was nothing for the mules to browse on. Man and beast were put on short rations. The mules finally huddled together and froze in their tracks. Old Bill declared that he had never before known the snow to be so deep and the weather to be so cold in this region. It became utterly impossible to make further progress, so for days the men slept, lived, and ate in the deep snow pits made by the swirling winds and their own tramping and pounding. They lived almost wholly on mule meat, and after the animals had all frozen to death, they lived on frozen mule meat and tallow candles. After 8 days of this, being on the verge of starvation, Bill Williams and 3 others volunteered to go to Taos, the nearest settlement 180 miles to the south, to secure relief. The 4 men started on Christmas Day with a blanket each, their rifles, a pound of sugar, a few pounds of frozen mule meat, some tallow candles, and a meager amount of macaroni. Within 3 days, the food was all gone. The next few days they subsisted on a hawk, a frozen otter, the leather from their shoes, browned to a crisp over their fire. For 8 days after that they lived on the parched leather of their boots, belts, and scabbards. One day Williams saw smoke in the distance. Gazing long, he said, "Boys, do you hear now? That smoke don't come from the fire of a white man. It's the smoke of an Indian camp, the Utes." He spoke slowly and was in mental distress as he held his head down between his hands. Then he went on, "I must tell you that when I was an ornery young man here in the mountains, I ran wild with the Utes, and they took me into their tribe. On a trip to Taos to get supplies for the tribe, I got on a spree and led the soldiers in an attack on my own people. It's the lowest down trick that I ever did, and rightly the Utes want my hair." In order to avoid the Indians, they had to go out of their way many miles. At last King, overcome by cold and hunger, could go no further. He lay down on the frozen ground and said, "You 3 go on, and when I'm rested a little I'll follow." The rest toiled on to the river a very short distance ahead, and after they had built a campfire and warmed themselves a little, Kreutzfeldt spoke. "I'll go back and help King in." "It's no use, boys," said Bill Williams. "Why?" asked Breckenridge. "Because I saw a raven circling around the spot where King laid down, and it went lower and lower in smaller and smaller circles. That's a sign of death, and I've never known it to fail." But Kreutzfeldt replied, "Well, I'm going anyway." The old trapper was right. King was dead. He had not moved after they had left him there. Kreutzfeldt returned exhausted and stunned. It had taken him 2 hours to go that little distance and return. He could talk of nothing but King's death. The next morning, Kreutzfeldt was too weak to go on. Breckenridge started painfully ahead and very soon had the amazing good fortune to kill a deer. He tore out its liver and devoured it as if he were a famished wolf. Then, with strength and hope instantly restored, he cut off a good chunk of flesh and took it back to the others. William seized the meat with his long talons and tore out great mouthfuls of the raw flesh, with a wild light of joy in his eyes. Kreutzfeldt, too, awoke from his stupor and ate the raw venison. At once hope and strength came back to him, and he staggered to his feet and embraced Breckenridge as his savior. They cooked and ate pieces of the venison nearly all night, and awoke the next morning to renew the feast throughout the day. The second morning after the killing of the deer, when they were ready to start on again, 4 horsemen came riding toward them from the river. "They're Indians," announced Breckenridge, and they all took the best positions they could for a fight. "Well, boys, do you hear now? When the fight's over, the Indians will have more hair, or we'll have more blankets." But after watching the party closely a little while, the old man stood up, waved his gun, and shouted with all his strength, "Well, look at that! That's Fremont himself!" Faced by grim despair, Fremont had left the camp in the mountains in the hope of meeting the relief party on the return trip. He had met 6 Ute Indians out hunting, and securing 4 old horses from them and meager provisions, had pressed on this far toward the settlement. 40 miles more of agony, 10 days of torture with frozen feet, brought Williams and his surviving comrades to a little settlement where everything possible was done to save and ease their frozen limbs. Just when and where and how old Bill Williams was finally rubbed out is shrouded in mystery. W.E. Curtis says that the Apaches took his scalp in Arizona in the 1860s, but he quotes no authority and offers no evidence. On the other hand, in Life in the Far West, with very good authority, we have an account of a band of hunters coming upon the frozen body of the old trapper in the spring of 1849, in a dismal canyon of the Rocky Mountains that was in the region of the Fremont disaster of the previous winter. This account has the stamp of authenticity and coincides with another trustworthy report about his end, to the effect that in the spring of 1849 he was sent with a band of hunters and trappers to recover many articles of value that had been left by the Fremont party when, on the point of death, they had been compelled to abandon their camp of snow and ice. The statement is made in this narrative that Bill Williams and his entire party were wiped out by the Ute Indians. The picture of Bill Williams's end is grim and vivid. The hunters found him where a camp had been made. The charred remains of logs stuck out from the snow where the campfire had been, and the old fellow's traps, arms, and saddle packs were strewn in confusion about him, where he sat with legs crossed under him, leaning against a pine trunk. His head, covered with snow, was bent forward on his breast, and about his rigid form his elkskin hunting shirt, greasy, frozen, and stained by the elements, hung loosely. Awestruck, the trappers approached the body and found it frozen hard as stone, in which state it had probably lain there for many days or weeks. A jagged rent in the breast of his leather coat and dark stains about it showed he had received a wound before his death, but it was impossible to say whether to his hurt or to sickness or to the natural decay of age was to be attributed the wretched and solitary end of poor Bill Williams. So that's the end of this story. It was about this old mountain man named Bill Williams. He had apparently betrayed the Utes, and then it is believed that they eventually caught up with him. So this was from the book Arizona Characters, and in future episodes we'll hear more about these interesting characters. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.